Released in 1978, Game of Death was the last official Bruce Lee film to be released in the US and elsewhere, premiering 5 years after Lee's classic blockbuster Enter the Dragon, the success of which he, unfortunately, was never able to see as he passed away 2 weeks before its scheduled theatrical release. According to Bruce Lee the Legend, a documentary released in 1984, Bruce Lee never quite crystallized the plot for Game of Death. Allegedly, he surmised only that his character, Billy Lowe, was to fight his way through a variety of martial arts masters in order to reach the top of a pagoda of several stories and claim whatever was waiting for him there. Without knowing what Lee would have eventually put together, the plot attempted by director Fred Weintraub and his producers, which was that Billy Lowe was to fake his own death so as to strike back at the syndicate who pursued him, was met with studio interference and many rewrites. Bruce Lee only ever appeared in Game of Death for 25 to 30 minutes prior to his passing. The technique used by the camera crew to incorporate clips from Lee's previous films in order to create the illusion that he filled in the missing scenes stood out very badly and could be quite distracting, especially to those familiar with his previous works. To be fair, the movie industry lacked the technology necessary to achieve this at the time. I mean, it isn't as though they could have compensated for Lee's absence with intense CGI like we would today. The action scenes in Game of Death were extraordinarily entertaining, as they somewhat mimic the choreography of its predecessors, along with including some unique and exciting surprises. The soundtrack for Game of Death was produced by John Barry, and while it may not have been quite as engaging as Lalo Schifrin's score for Enter the Dragon, and could at times be rather repetitive, it still succeeded in complementing the action and was compelling nevertheless. Perhaps the film's greatest drawback is that it showed actual footage of Bruce Lee's funeral. Although this suited the plot of Bruce Lee's character, Billy Lowe, faking his own death perfectly, many of the actors who worked on Bruce Lee's previous films considered this a blow beneath the belt, and I must say I agree. In fact, many of them refused to be cast in Game of Death for that reason. Honestly, who could blame them? As for the actors who did appear in Game of Death, Hugh O'Brian, Gig Young, Dean Jagger, and Colleen Camp among them, they all gave exceptional performances, for a martial arts film, that is. Especially Dean Jagger. He played the villain who shot Lee's character in the face. His cold, calculating ruthlessness was often unpredictable and kept you on edge. So I must address a theory of mine regarding the scene in Game of Death, where the aforementioned villain shot Lee's character in the face, with real bullets instead of blanks. This was suspiciously familiar to a scene that was shot during The Crow, which was released in 1994.
Kill the crow and destroy the man.
Who carries their soul to the land of the dead. But
the only difference between the scene from Game of Death and The Crow is that Brandon Lee actually was murdered. Once again, with real bullets rather than blanks. Do you see the correlation? Granted, both Brandon Lee and his father before him died of entirely different causes, but their deaths were no less tragic. To the martial arts community, to the movie industry, but above all, to their friends and families. May they both rest in peace. The review must go on. So, Game of Death has a bad guy problem. There are far too many of them. One would think that Dean Jagger would have been the ultimate villain. When you found out who the head of the syndicate really was, who they were all taking orders from, well, Let's just say he posed about as much threat as Don Altobello from Godfather Part 3. Despite its flaws, you can always skip the funeral scene on your Blu-ray or DVD. Game of Death has a rewatchable rate of about 80%. And on a personal scale of 1 to 5, 1 being a train wreck and 5 being a masterpiece, I give Game of Death a 4.2 rating. Thank you so much for making it to the end of this video. Your viewership means the world to me. So thank you. Thank you very much. Before I go, I must shout out heartfelt birthday wishes to the man, to the myth, and to the legend. If Bruce Lee were alive today, he would have been 80 years old.